An annual celebration of the powerful pictures which tell us the stories behind the headlines. The Visa pour l'Image Festival is back in Perpignan, here in France, with a world-class selection of photojournalism on display. From the harrowing images of persecuted populations in Ethiopia, Syria and Armenia, to the effects of the coronavirus pandemic around the world. There's also a chance to reflect upon beauty and resilience, with scenes of marital bliss in Haiti and some of the most stunning wildlife photography being published today. One of those exhibitions zooms in on a devastating conflict which broke out in Ethiopia in late 2020. In the Tigray region, military strikes, burning and looting are reported to have killed up to 52,000 people in what many are calling a case of ethnic cleansing. For the Tigrayans who survived, escaping the country seemed to be the only option. A journey that Nariman Al-Mufti documented in Fleeing the Tigray. The Egyptian-Canadian photographer joins us now to tell us more about that work. Nariman, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now,
Thank you
these
for having me.
images are very powerful. They conjure up a sense of movement and displacement. And when that conflict broke out in the Tigray region, close to Eritrea and Sudan, I believe it was extremely difficult for journalists to get access, get to the scene and report. How did you manage to negotiate that? Can you give us the context?
So what happened was the first thing the government did was completely shut down all communications inside the Tigray region. And it was so difficult to get information. And the government was also taking people's phones. So there was no UGC, user-generated content in general from civilians. So there were some reports coming out, and then we found some news of people fleeing and coming into the borders in Sudan. So I told my boss I want to go to Sudan to cover the conflict and see what's going on. So that's how it started. That's where the journalism began picking up. It's actually from the borders in Sudan, because there were about like 20,000 people rushing into Sudan.
And we see many of those huge bodies of people in your photographs indeed. And we see people crossing the Tekezi River. Your images show moments of tension, stress, even fights breaking out at times. And I can imagine that the COVID pandemic was a concern at that time for a lot of people as well. What did you observe in terms of the major struggles for those people on their way into Sudan and once they were there?
Obviously, people were very dehydrated. They were coming in like really tired. There were pregnant women, that are malnourished, and lots of children were malnourished and just so dehydrated and hungry. I mean, these people have walked for hours in very difficult conditions, and they were just arriving with nothing, especially in the beginning. People left with just the clothes on their back. That's it. There was so much stress, and people needed aid, and that's why in a lot of there are two images there. People are fighting because when Muslim Aid would give out food, people would stand in lines, but it wasn't enough, and people were getting stressed and angry. They're hungry.
Extreme conditions there. Now, among
Yes.
your photographs, there's a very striking portrait of a young man. I think he's named Abraeli Minazbo. His hands are wrapped in bandages. Can you tell us a bit more about his story?
So Abrahali is actually a 22-year-old student, university student. He's actually a dancer. And throughout the month, last November, when I was in Sudan, we were trying to find physical evidence of wounds, because there were lots of people that were saying, there were different reports coming out saying, no, it's Amhara forces, Tigranian forces that are responsible for a massacre against the Amhara, and then there's the opposite. There was a lot of conflicting reports, so we wanted to see someone that had, physical evidence. So Abrahali I met in Hamdayet, which is at the border. He was in a medical ward, and Amhara forces and they have, I mean, under them there's a group called El Fano. So El Fano means young. They're basically allied with the Amhara, basically thugs, and they attacked him with machetes. So the wounds you see on his face and his arm was partially they were thinking of amputating it because it was completely broken. So there's a surgeon there that would just had it intact till they see if they're going to amputate it or not. And what's incredible about this is he wasn't a soldier, he wasn't involved in the fighting at all. He was just a student at university, a dancer. So it was very interesting to see him and what he's been through and hear his story.
Incredible documentary evidence there of how the conflict affects normal people, as
Yeah.
you say. Now, you mentioned that access to that area is very difficult. Among the rare journalists who were able to get to the Tigray region, Argentinian photographer Eduardo Soteras managed to document the situation there too. France 24's Clovis Casali spoke to him and others showing work in Perpignan about their work on the front lines across the globe.
I've been working on poaching and hunting for several years. Over the past 10 years in the United States, regulations have changed a lot. Hunting is no longer allowed all year round, so a business of hunting exotic animals has developed. People can hunt them as they're considered by law as cattle.
Melanie Wenger sent out hundreds of emails to various ranches before Eric, a hunter from Texas, agreed to meet her. The French photographer's work, Sugar Moon, is a journey from Trump's America to safaris in Namibia.
I don't share personal views or my opinion. My work is to go where others can't, and that's the case here. I try to show what's going on, and then the public can be fully informed and make their own opinion.
Eduardo Soteras and his AFP colleagues also struggled for access. They were among the few journalists to be allowed into Tigray, a region of Ethiopia where war has been raging. The Argentinian photographer met this past year traumatized civilians, forced to flee their homes, many speaking of how soldiers brutalized and raped women and children.
I remember us entering the area of Mekele and the north of Mekele, and a group of 50 people waiting outside the place where we were having an interview. In many cases, bringing USB drives with material that they documented and giving it to you. An USB drive is not something cheap that you can buy in Ethiopia, no? People were very desperate to tell their story. They felt the need to tell us what happened to them, to their families.
In Myanmar, the arrest of de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi triggered a wave of protest and a violent crackdown by the army. An exhibition shows the reality on the ground, but its author won't be here in Perpignan. He had to remain anonymous to ensure his safety. It's one example of what Visa pour l'Image is meant to be, a platform for photojournalists to tell their stories and offer a different perspective on world events.
Naiman, in that report, Eduardo speaks about the desire of Tigrayans to make sure that facts, evidence are being published and being revealed. And another country in which reporting is extremely difficult is Yemen. In the past, it's been really hard to access accurate information from that conflict. And yet, you won a Pulitzer Prize in 2019 for your work on the war and the famine there. That work was widely disseminated. So despite global crackdowns on journalism, are you optimistic, having been able to cover the situation in Yemen? Are you optimistic about the facts, the evidence getting out?
Yes, I am actually. I mean, it takes a lot of work and pushing to definitely get access in general, but you do get there at some point. And somewhere like Yemen, you know, there are lots of civilians that do document too, so it's a bit easier than a place like Tigray, you know. and I think as long as you push and you're with the right people, because I mean the work we do is backed up with a lot of people behind the scenes that are helping us get in and helping us with access. We don't just go in there, you know, and just go wherever, you know. There's people that are backing us, you know, and trust us. So I do think we have to continue. I mean, there's no question of having to continue do journalism and the work.
And as we saw there in Myanmar, many of those local people taking significant risks to help you, as you mentioned.
Yes, of course. I mean, these people are key. These people need the medals and awards for what they go through and what they do for teams to get in. Definitely.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Nahiman. That's all we've got time for.
Thank you.
And Nahiman's El Mufti's Fleeing the Tigray is part of the exhibitions this year at Visa pour l'Image. We'll leave you with images from the winner of the Visa pour l'Image Award for Best Digital News Story. Tyler Hicks took a deep dive into the Brazilian Amazon for his coverage of the COVID crisis there. The New York Times staff photographer has been applauded for capturing the human cost of the pandemic in those remote regions, especially its effects on the indigenous population. Here's a look at some of his prize-winning work. Otherwise, remember you can get more arts and culture on France24.com, as well as on our social media feeds. Do stay with us for more news coming up just after this.